At least 15 million South Africans suffer from food insecurity. That means they don't have enough nutritious food to live healthy lives. Research conducted by the Institute of Development Studies, University of the Western Cape and University of Cape Town has looked at food insecurity and food justice in the country and what can be done to help these problems. Let's speak now to Stephen Devereux, who's the Research Fellow at the Institute for Development Studies. Stephen, good to have you on the program this evening. Firstly, tell us, what do you see as the primary causes of food insecurity in the country, given South Africa's food production capacity?
Good evening, and thank you for this invitation. The causes of hunger and food insecurity, of course, are very complex. But in South Africa, the problem is not a lack of food. We have to be very clear about that. There is plenty of food in South Africa. We export maize and we import all the other food that we need in addition to the production that we already have. So we always have more food in the country than we need. The problem, of course, is inadequate access. And poor access to food is related to poverty, and it's related to unemployment, of course, and it's related to inequality. We are the most unequal country in the world, and inequality has increased since 1994. And we have one of the highest rates of unemployment, especially youth unemployment in the world. So it's poverty, lack of income, which leads to lack of ability to access food, which causes hunger and food insecurity.
I want us to expand a bit more on this point. How much does poverty and inequality then contribute to food insecurity, especially regarding access to nutritious food across socioeconomic groups in the country?
That's a very important point to emphasize. We're not just looking at enough calories, like enough maize or maize meal. We're looking at nutritious diets. And of course, nutritious diets require diversified foods that require access to protein, eggs, fish, meat, as well as fruit and vegetables for minerals and vitamins. And so a nutritious diet is more expensive than a basic calorie diet. And the problem is that people are living below even the food poverty line, which means their basic food needs can't even be met. If you get social grants, for example, they're not enough to buy a nutritious diet. They're well below a nutritious diet basket of food. And so the main problem, of course, is, as I said, not lack of food, but certain people across socioeconomic groups lacking access to food.
I want to turn our focus on this recommendation about expanding social grants to address hunger. Do you think the current system is sufficient to meet the needs of vulnerable groups, especially with this rising food prices that we are seeing?
Well, I first want to commend South Africa for having the most comprehensive social protection or social security system in Africa. It's a model that other countries are envious of. We certainly have grants that cover children, older persons, people with disabilities, and since COVID, also unemployed and low-income working age adults. So those are commendable interventions, and the government is doing a lot to try to boost people's income so that they can access food. So the problem is not coverage. We have 19 million people receiving social grants, or 26 million if you count the special COVID SRD grant. The problem is that the value of those grants is not sufficient. So if you're, for example, if you take a child support grant, one child support grant is sufficient to buy 2/3 of a nutritious food basket for that child. And we know that the grant is also shared among other household members, especially unemployed adults or carers. And we know that it's also spent on other things apart from food. So the child support grant, although very, very important in low-income households, the value is just not sufficient to meet people's basic needs, even for nutritious diets.
As we explore responses here, how can the National School Nutrition Program then be expanded to even provide nutrition for children during school holidays and weekends?
I think there's 2 points to emphasize here. The first is that if we look at the most powerful indicator of hunger, which is stunting of children that are too short for their age compared to an average well-nourished child, that has stayed constant since 1994 at around 1 in 4 children. 25% of our children have stunted growth. And that means that children at the age of 5, up to the age of 5, are chronically undernourished. They're not getting enough food. So by the time they reach school and get access to the school meals, the National School Nutrition Program, they already are stunted. It's already too late. So the first thing to do is to intervene in the early learning stages at the preschool age. You know, the toddlers, the infants, children up to 5 also need adequate nutrition. So we need to think about how we can strengthen that part of the system. Then when it comes to school meals, they're also very, very important. because they supplement the inadequate food that children get at home. But they only apply during school days. That means during term time, not at weekends, not in school holidays. And so we are arguing that we need to have some access to food for children all year round. If they are inadequately nourished, they need to have a meal every single day. And that means getting access to food even during holidays and over weekends.
Let's look at this idea of ensuring land access, especially for low-income households. How feasible would you say this is, and what support should the government provide to help these people produce their own food?
I think that we're looking particularly at Black, rural, female-headed households when we talk about this particular issue, because they are the ones that are probably most marginalized and most unable to feed their children, especially, for example, seasonal farm workers who are working for 3 or 4 months of the year during the farming season and then unemployed for 7 or 8 months, get very little access to unemployment insurance. And so during those other off-season months, it's really important that they have access to a garden where they can grow their own basic food, their maize, their vegetables, maybe some fruit as well, so that they can feed themselves during that period of unemployment or seasonal hunger every year. I think that seasonal hunger is the most under-recognized aspect of hunger and food insecurity in our country. It's a really big issue, and we're not even aware of it because most of us live in cities where we go to supermarkets, there's food there all year round, we get our income every month. But seasonal farm workers don't have the luxury of income every month, and they don't have access to supermarkets, and they really could do with some small gardens that could just help them grow enough food to survive those winter months.
But there's also a lot of wastage. With 1/3 of food wasted in South Africa, what steps can be taken to reduce food loss? And how can the government also ensure that these strategies are implemented?
This is another crucial point. It's estimated that about 1/3 of food produced or sold in South Africa is lost in the form of wastage. And that's about 30 billion meals a year, 30 billion meals. And if we had 20 billion extra meals, we'd be able to solve the food insecurity problem. So in other words, we're wasting more food than we need to solve the hunger problem. Government has drafted a food loss and waste strategy. It's been around for a couple of years, but it has not been finalized. It has not been adopted. It has not been implemented. So we're arguing very strongly that that needs to happen. We need to have a coherent approach to tackling food waste and also rescuing wasted food, as some NGOs already do, and making sure that food isn't just thrown out from a supermarket the day it expires, but it's actually rescued and given to people who need it, because it's not unsafe until a few days later in most cases.
Stephen, what policies could be implemented to really regulate essential food prices, but also make them more affordable without undermining producers' interests?
There's always a delicate balance here, because we need to make sure that producers, especially small farmers, are protected and farm workers are protected against prices being very low. But we also need to make sure that food prices are affordable for low-income people, unemployed people, and so on. So the suggestion is not to interfere with food prices that are earned by farmers, but for government to intervene to protect prices for consumers, for example, by offering them discounts or adding a voucher to their social grant, so that in addition to getting the cash, they also get a voucher for a nutritious basket of food that they can redeem at a local outlet, a food store, a supermarket, or whatever. So there are ways that government can intervene to provide additional nutritious food, specifically targeted, good quality, high nutritious food, which will actually support production and trade and not undermine it, because government will be there to make sure that people are accessing that food, but by subsidizing its price, not by forcing producers to take unfairly low prices.
Let's take a step back and look at seasonal workers again. How can the government better protect seasonal workers from food insecurity during off-seasons? And what role should social protection systems then play?
One of the problems that seasonal workers face is they don't have continuous employment, and therefore they don't make contributions to UIF, unemployment insurance, on a regular basis. And so after they've cashed in their unemployment insurance for a few months, it runs out. And sometimes they have to wait 2 or 3 years, 2 or 3 seasons of making more contributions before they get further payouts. And so that needs to be changed. You know, we need to say that just because you have a seasonal contract does not mean you don't have a right to unemployment insurance when you're clearly unemployed. And seasonal workers are particularly vulnerable because they fall between the cracks of people who have access to good unemployment insurance and others who have access to social grants. But seasonal workers have access to neither, except perhaps child support grants through their children. So seasonal workers need protection against seasonal unemployment. It also needs to be recognized that they produce our food, and they should be rewarded for that, not punished as they are at the moment. And of course, labor laws need to be respected as well, because very often permanent workers are being casualized, particularly, specifically so that farmers don't have to pay their contributions into social security funds like the UIF.
But are there lessons that South Africa can learn from countries like Brazil in reducing child stunting and hunger? And how can those be adapted to our context?
Very much so. And in fact, I want to mention here the G20 and the fact that the G20 presidency has moved from Brazil last year to South Africa this year. And Brazil had a fantastic success with reducing hunger and stunting in their country over several years, because they adopted an approach of saying, let's identify hunger as the problem and see all that we need to do to address that problem and try to solve it. And so they had a comprehensive approach, whereas I feel that in South Africa, it's more like, we know that children are hungry, we know that people are poor, so we'll just give them a bit of cash and hopefully that will solve the problem. And of course, that's not enough. It's not a coherent strategy just to throw a bit of money at the problem. So in Brazil, they had a zero hunger program, and in Chile as well, they had a program called 5 by 5 by 5, which aimed to reduce child stunting, under 5 child stunting, by 5% in 5 years. And they overachieved on that. And in both cases, Peru and Brazil, they implemented a range of policies, including cash grants or social grants, but also subsidizing food, educating mothers about appropriate breastfeeding rather than using infant formula, improving public health and water supply so there wasn't cholera and children weren't getting diarrhea and losing all the nutritional value of their food. Supporting small farmers as well, and expanding their school feeding programs. So a range of interventions was used and applied to the specific challenge of reducing hunger. And in those countries, they managed to achieve great success. If you compare South Africa, as I mentioned before, we've had 25% child stunting rate for the last 30 years. It hasn't shifted at all. If you look at other upper middle income countries, of which South Africa is one, on average, upper middle income countries have reduced their stunting rates from 18% to 6% in the last 20 years. And we have not made any progress on that at all. And I think that's really quite shameful.
Stephen, we have run out of time for this conversation, but very interesting is that you advocate for appointing a Minister of Food. How would this role differ from existing departments, and how can it coordinate efforts to eradicate hunger?
I just want to mention that this is an initiative or a proposal that comes from the Union Against Hunger, which was launched this week, and I'm a member of that. And the Union Against Hunger is saying we need to take hunger seriously as the government has taken electricity. When President Ramaphosa declared we need to have a Minister of Electricity to solve the crisis of load shedding, why don't we do the same thing with hunger? Food is addressed by agriculture, it's addressed by DSD, social development, it's addressed by health, but there isn't actually one focal point or one minister whose sole job it is to try to eradicate hunger in this country. And we have the Sustainable Development Goal of halving hunger by 2030. We are way off track on that, but let's at least start making some progress. And one way we could do that, we're arguing, is to say, let's have a Minister of Food, maybe a National Food Commission, and see what we can achieve in the next 5 years to really start tackling the scourge of hunger, because we don't need to have hunger on the scale that we do in a country as rich as ours.
Stephen Devereux, thank you so much for your time and sharing your valuable insights on food insecurity and food justice in South Africa as well. You've also heard the various proposals they've made as a body that's advocating for this, also including advocating for having a Minister of Food. A very interesting proposal being made in that regard.